I must honestly say that I feel somewhat overwhelmed because this audience consists of rather a large number of people who know me rather well. It's always very embarrassing for a politician to speak to an audience, most of whom know him or her rather well, because the expressions of doubt and of dubiety on their faces give the game away. So forgive me, forgive me if I'm very cautious about what I say. I do want to begin by saying that it is for me a very, very great pleasure that Kathy and Linda have managed to get here. I remember Nelson Polsby, who used to be the majestic figure in the IGS down the road, who I remember being graciously invited into his presence. It's the only word to use, his presence, as he sat on that marvelous, what I always regard as the Sultan's throne. And you came up and talked to him, and you got these wonderful pearls of wisdom from him in this rather splendid sort of setting. Nelson, I remember on one occasion, because he was very keen on following British elections. He got a special pleasure out of visiting British elections, about which he knew a great deal. Linda will probably know this story, but it's true. He suddenly showed up at the, I asked him to come and see our campaign in my constituency. And at that time, which was in the 70s, British cars were even smaller than they are today. They were extremely small, and they did about 65 miles to the gallon. They were very green cars in that sense, but there was very little room in them. And I'd asked one of my party supporters to come and drive to the airport to pick up this deeply distinguished American academic. And I remember the awful embarrassment of wondering whether we could ever get Nelson and the driver into the same car. It turned out rather quickly that it was virtually impossible to get both Nelson and the driver into the same car, but we managed somehow, because Nelson had to give a talk shortly afterwards, and by deeply breathing in, he managed to fit in with the driver and with me, and we managed to get there. Afterwards, the driver said to me, "I think you'd better get a bigger car if you want to keep taking this gentleman around," and that was indeed the case. Linda and Nelson were, for me, great, marvelous people to come and see, and always had a huge amount of illumination to give one. And about Marty, of course, Marty was one of the great figures who knew a huge amount about higher education and had a great influence on the structure of higher education in Britain. And because I was Education Secretary, I saw a good deal of both Marty and Kathy at that time, and found what Marty had to say always profoundly worth thinking about. Well, having said that, I was been asked by Bob, my old friend until today, to talk a bit about what it's like to be a politician, and then to add a little bit about what it's like to be a woman politician. And then I will, if I may, split what I've got to say into two bits, both relatively short to give you plenty of time to talk. The first part will be a personal bit about being a politician and why I wanted to be one and what the problems are that confront politicians today. The second part is really about what I regard as the four burning issues that confront us at the present time, and that many of you who are half my age will be dealing with for good or evil. And I believe the choices that you make and that will be made in the next 5 or 10, or at the most 8 years, are going to be totally critical for the future of the world. I can't put that too strongly. I'll come back to it later. I think we're living in a period rather like the period immediately after the French Revolution or something, or for that matter, perhaps the American Revolution. More like the French Revolution, I think, where huge issues are confronting the world and where it will be very easy to get the answer to those problems wrong. Well, beginning personally, I was always extremely excited by politics. My father was an unsuccessful politician. He was a man who ran several times for Parliament, always lost, because when he ran, we were living between the wars when the Labour Party, of which he was a very strong supporter, had very little chance against, at that time, a very powerful and very, very demanding Conservative hegemony in my own country. Oddly enough, fed by the Great Recession. People were so frightened about how to deal with the recession that what they did was to turn back to the more, as it were, conventional ways of dealing with it. And one of the most conventional ways, when faced with a recession in the 1930s, was that you cut public expenditure, making the recession worse. We didn't have a Roosevelt. You, I think if you hadn't had a Roosevelt, would have come off very badly indeed. We didn't come off quite so badly because Britain's an strangely stoical country which doesn't get as upset as it should about things going wrong. Nevertheless, that was the world in which my father first became a politician. I became a politician really completely out of conviction. When I was very young, my parents, at my pleading, I kept begging them to let me go to the local state school. Now, this is a time, we're talking about the 40s now, when you didn't go to a state school. Tragically, as is now again true of the United States, or many parts of it, because you came from the middle classes. And no middle-class child went to a state-financed, or what you would call a public school. But I was determined to go to this school because I'd met one or two kids in my neighborhood who went there, and I wanted to see what it was like. And I went to this school with my parents' blessing. And that's when I encountered poverty, real day-to-day poverty, because the school was full of youngsters who had to share a pair of boots between 3 or 4 members of the same family. Only one child could come to school because only one child could wear the pair of boots. This is literally true. Where every other day our heads were searched for lice, where we were continually subjected to investigations to see whether we had rickets, because rickets were very common in that time when the nutrition was very poor, and when most women, not all by any means, but most mothers, had what were called at that time dropped wombs, because there was no proper antenatal or postnatal care. So it was brought in on me because I was, in my own eyes, a privileged child. They didn't know I was a privileged child. I pretended I was my mother's cook's child. So they never knew. Because at that time, so deep were the class divisions in Britain, that if my schoolmates had known I was not my mother's cook's child, but my mother's child, I would have had my head bashed to pieces on the tarmac of the school playground, and I wasn't going to have that. So I not only pretended, I became what I was pretending to be, if you understand what I say that. As a child, I lived with my mates. I wore the same sort of clothes. I didn't want to stand out in any way. And it brought home to me what seemed to me, and I was talking about a child of the age of 8 and 9, a completely unacceptable. I couldn't see any argument for people being treated so differently simply because of the accident of birth. And that was what really took me into politics. And I'm talking still about a schoolgirl, a child, partly because the aching sense of somewhere between guilt and anger was met by the great post-war Labour government. And that government came like a new dawn. Wordsworth once said, "Great was it in that day to be alive, and to be young was very heaven." And that was the way I felt about it. I seemed to be born into the recreation of a society immediately after the end of the Second World War, which was all about bringing to people the basic necessities of their public services and of their lives. And of course it was studied by the National Health Service, the Social Security Act, the introduction of national insurance, huge changes in the body politic. In a way, the ideal of what it was to be a democratic socialist. And I've been a democratic socialist from that day to this. I've never changed, although the needs have altered and become, of course, global rather than at that time largely national. And I suppose that's one of the big changes. What did I find? I found, as some of you will, though it was much truer when I was young, that the world of politics was dominated primarily by clubs. Clubs in the case of the Conservatives, trade unions in the case of Labour. It was essentially a class politics at that time. And so you belonged to one side or the other. It was a very, very clear division. There were very few fuzzinesses in it. And if you went into it, you became immediately part of a community, of a circle of brothers and sisters who were very close to one another, worked together, were friends together, knew and loved one another. It was harder in one way, much harder to be a woman. I still remember, for example, when I first became elected to the House of Commons, I decided I would go walking into rooms that had always been closed to me because they were rooms for members of Parliament. And I saw with joy a door which said members only, and I plunged into it to discover it was a gentleman's lavatory. And all the doors marked members only were gentlemen's lavatories, except a few that were gentlemen's bars. If you were a woman, you had a special different description, which was lady members. And when you went into lady members, what you were confronted by immediately was a chintz sofa and an ironing board. It was not an obvious urinal like members only. It was a rather genteel little sitting room for women members. There were 23 of us when I first got elected in a House of Commons of 635. And we were either patronised in a perfectly pleasant way, or we were regarded as either shrill or impossible or absurdly fanatical or something of that kind. I won't go on about my youth, except to say that I have never, ever found the criticism made of politicians to be true. In my country, the common criticism one often hears as you do that old-fashioned thing which we still do called canvassing, from door to door, knocking on doors, asking people where they stand and so forth. The argument that I find hardest to beat is the one that says they're all in it for what they can get out of it, quote, unquote. Quite frequently met, probably one elector in every 5 who says anything. Of course, a lot of electors say nothing like, you know, this is my favourite television programme and would you mind going away? But among those who do say something, you do get about 1 in 5 who say they're all in it for what you can get out of it. A remark that drives me to almost total fury. It drives me to almost total fury because what is quite clear from the polls in the United States and in the United Kingdom is that when you ask people about their own representative, their own member of parliament, their own senator, they almost always say, he's not like the others. She's not a bit like the others. My senator, stroke congressman, stroke district legislator is a good guy, a fine woman. It's all the others who are just awful. So you get this picture where if people look at the person straightforwardly, not through the spectrum of a highly partisan media, you begin to see the human being, and you begin to realize that in most cases, not all, but most cases, that person is driven by a real desire to be representative of their community or to bring better opportunities to their community or whatever it may be. Now, I'm going to qualify this in 2 ways. For your country, if you're American, and for mine, if you're European. The qualification for America, and to my mind it's a very serious qualification, is the extent to which money runs politics in this country, certainly above the state level. I'm sufficiently concerned about it to sometimes think that the United States is slipping from a democracy to a plutocracy. Money is simply too important. When I read about the near 100 million, which is the aim apparently of Democratic Party candidates in this upcoming presidential election, bluntly I find that absolutely appalling. I've run or fought 11 general elections in my life and 2 by-elections. The maximum amount I've ever been allowed to spend is £10,000, which is $20,000. The reason for that is that there is an extremely strict limit on the amount you could spend in any given district or constituency. And if you spend more than that limit, which is laid down by law, your opponents can ask for a complete audit of what you spent, which incidentally includes things like the petrol, the gas for your car, the overnight stay for one of your speakers. Everything is in it. And if that audit shows that you've got beyond that £10,000, it's now about £15,000, you are disqualified. The election is chucked out, and you're chucked out with it. It's a very effective sanction. All the efforts that I can't tell you how often I've lectured about common cause, about electoral reform, about electoral finance reform in the States seem to have run into the sand because people have found ways around them like soft money and all the rest of it. And it's got to be addressed seriously at some point soon, or else the United States at the federal level, I would repeat, much more the federal than the state or local level, will no longer be able to claim it is a democracy. It's already extraordinary to me that a majority of members of the Senate are millionaires. And I have to ask a little bit, how much does one really represent the people who don't live in the same life or have the same quality of life as one does oneself, if that's the kind of level at which we've gone. Let me turn from that to say, I said I'd say 1 word about Britain. In Britain, I think the really serious problem is the weakness of the legislature. The legislature has steadily lost ground as an effective legislature to the executive. The executive, or the government, has much too great power, I think, vis-a-vis the legislature. and the House of Commons is a relatively ineffective instrument these days. In fact, the paradox is that the House of Lords is more effective than the House of Commons, and that can't really be right. But it's true, because the House of Lords consistently takes a very strong line on civil liberties issues and issues concerning, for example, terrorism, habeas corpus, and all the rest of it, than does the House of Commons. But it's not the way it ought to be. Right, the problems. There are four major problems that I think are going to confront your generation of politicians, the people who are here in this school, and who I hope will think about it as you emerge from this school, and congratulations on being here. It's a simply marvelous experiment, and you're part of that experiment, and one day you will look back and say, we were the generation that made this institute, and that's terribly important. It's a very great privilege in my view. The first of those, I'll be quite quick about it, they're all, I think, huge, and they're all ones that are going to engage you in the most serious possible way. The first is obviously climate change. The day before yesterday, actually, I was at the Center for Foreign Relations in New York, of which I'm a member of the International Advisory Board, and we had a long discussion about climate change. The agreed bit, the consensus that came out, was at the time we've got is far shorter than we believe. In fact, every single day, new facts come forward to show that we are taking far too relaxed a timetable view of what's happening. Only yesterday, scientists were described as being astounded by the speed at which the ice cap in Greenland was melting, and the impact already on the rising of waters, which one can see the beginnings of in the last few years in terms of the level of floods and so forth. We have almost no time. I'm not Al Gore, who I think has done a marvelous job in being one of the very few politicians who's taken this issue on head on, but we don't realize how little time we have. What do I mean by that? I'll give you another story about this before I move on. At the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Advisory Committee, there was a very prominent German businessman, one of the biggest businessmen in Germany. And he sat and I sat through a long discussion, at the heart of which lay the proposition: nobody in the United States will ever accept an increased tax on gas. Just unacceptable. Politicians can't bring themselves to even talk about it, let alone do it. You can't put up gas even by a cent a gallon without running into huge political losses. And who's going to start? Republican? Democrat? Anybody else? Everybody said nobody will start. The businessman said to me after the meeting, I don't understand America, he said, at all. I don't come here very often. I simply don't understand it. But last week I went to a big conference with the French business leaders, and we discussed how we could make our governments more aware of the speed at which the change in climate was coming. We discussed how we could make our products more green. We discussed what taxes we would support. We discussed what sort of market there was for truly green components, as distinct from rather brown components in manufacturing and elsewhere. They were alarmed. Even in Germany, probably the most advanced country in the world in terms of being green among the bigger economies, at the inability of people in America to understand. You probably know that the tax in Germany, as the tax in Britain, on gas is something like 75% on top of the value of the gas itself. We pay in Britain, for example, at the present time, I worked it out, thought you might be interested to know, I paid the other day £95 for 95 pounds for 8 gallons of petrol. That is to say, nearly $200. The second issue, this being, I think, the worst of all, the second issue, which to my mind is one which again is going to have to be confronted by politicians much more brave than most of us have so far dared to be, is my favorite, nuclear proliferation. Well, let's have again a very quick look at that. The NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, was the child of John F. Kennedy and of the Russians of that time, Khrushchev and Bulgarin. Kennedy had seen, and I was there and I was alive and I saw it too, the world get to 1 minute to midnight at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've probably never been closer to blowing up the world than in 1963. And when you read the history of that, going back on it, I still remember watching very grainy pictures on television of a convoy of old Russian ships steadily ploughing across the water towards Havana, Cuba, where they were going to unload missiles, in the face of an American threat that if those missiles were unloaded, the United States would have no alternative but to riposte with, if necessary, nuclear weapons. And I sat there. I had a child at that time who was only a couple of years old, fast asleep in a cradle. And I remember looking at the television and thinking to myself, oh my God, she's not even going to see adulthood before all this happens and the sky falls in. And I can't tell you what it was like watching minute after minute, hour after hour, as those boats steadily approached Cuba until that minute when, almost within sight of Cuba, they suddenly did a great U-turn and went back again. When you read the history, and if you've got time, read it, the brilliant history of what happened, it is an astonishing story of the wisdom and the imagination of the Kennedy brothers. The untold story is that beyond even the discussions that they had with the Russians, Kennedy, through Robert, made a promise to the United Nations that if everything went wrong and if at the last minute before a confrontation, the then General Secretary U Thant was to make a public declaration to both sides begging them to withdraw. He promised them in advance that not only would he, Kennedy, respond positively, but that he would also be willing to say that the missiles in Turkey, which had partly elicited this response, would be withdrawn. In other words, U Thant would know before he asked or made the plea that that plea would, at least by America, be responded to positively. It was Robert Kennedy who drafted U Thant's letter, a fact that is not widely known. Since that time, the NPT has almost miraculously managed to keep the number of nuclear powers down to 5 at first. Those same old victors of the Second World War who always show up as being the people that are the architects of our world, but they're declining as the architects of our world. They still are just about, clinging on by their fingernails. And those 5, as you know, were Russia, the United States, China, France, and Britain. And they all agreed to the NPT, and the NPT covered a fundamental bargain. The nature of that bargain was that the nuclear powers, the existing nuclear powers, would retain their nuclear weapons, but would promise to embark upon a major program of multilateral disarmament sometime within the next few years. This is part of Article 6 of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And the other side of the bargain was that no country that wasn't yet a nuclear power would become one, and that would be the other side of this bargain. You weren't a nuclear power, you would never become one. You were a nuclear power, you would enter into massive reductions of your armament to the point where it would simply be a deterrent and couldn't really be an offensive weapon. Article 6 has never been kept at all. The major nuclear powers have hardly ever reduced their vast arsenals, with the single exception of a certain number at the time of the much underestimated President George Bush I, who deserves much more credit than he gets for the work he did on disarmament, particularly the SALT Treaty, the European Conventional Treaty, and others. He's actually quite an impressive president on the peacekeeping side, even though he may not have been very impressive in other ways. The nuclear, non-nuclear side held for years and years. Israel slipped through secretly, never having ever admitted that it had happened and never having signed on to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. She's had nuclear weapons for at least 20 years, but she's kept quiet about it, and she doesn't either sign or unsign treaties. It just quietly is there. India and Pakistan, more openly, also refused to join the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and both developed nuclear weapons. Pakistan almost inevitably once India had, and India partly because she was at the time very frightened of a nuclear weapon, China. You then had, right up to the present time, 8 countries that had nuclear weapons, and 2 that had decided to withdraw from any nuclear weapons development, rather amazingly, one being South Africa, and the other, as you know, much more recently being Libya. That left 2 in the middle, so to speak. two who are currently developing nuclear weapons, North Korea and Iran. No time to go in detail except to say that in both cases, North Korea and Iran, there is one fundamental issue that you need to think about very, very carefully as people who intend to go into, I hope you will, all of you, into public life in your own country, or if you're Americans, in the United States. Both represent the dismissal of diplomacy as an effective method of politics. The United States knows nothing about North Korea and has had almost no diplomatic relations with North Korea for at least 40 years. The United States has had no diplomatic relationships with Iran since 1979, at the time of the hostage crisis. No connections at all. None of the fibrous links that enable countries to have reasonable, thoughtful conversations with one another. It is frankly wildly dangerous. One has to ask oneself, why is it that diplomacy, a very crucial part of keeping the peace, of arranging for countries to talk in a civilized way to one another, has been put on the back burner in the United States and in some other countries, but primarily this country. This country, more than any other, has used no dialogue as a political weapon. In my view, an extremely foolish political weapon. And you can see it with Iran now, when nobody knows anything about this country except that it's very mysterious, which isn't much help if you're actually trying to get some agreement on the development of nuclear weapons. I think the prime reasons are two, and again, no time to go into it because I'm going to come to an end quite soon. The first reason is that leaders, political leaders, driven by the media, insist upon running their own foreign policies even though they understand very little about them. They don't listen to Colin Powell. They don't listen much to Condoleezza Rice. They listen to the people around them who are essentially political consultants, not diplomatic or foreign affairs consultants, but political consultants, whose first mind is what's going to be the impact on tomorrow's headlines or on the next congressional elections or whatever it may be. The second reason, apart from this centrality, if I may say so, hubristic centrality of the leader, and it's not just the United States this is true of, it's also true of many European countries, many Asian countries, the insistence that one does everything oneself, however little one knows about it. The other thing that I think has tremendously weakened diplomacy has been the rise of the influence of the departments of defense. If you take the United States as one example, then it's quite clear that in recent years the Pentagon has completely overshadowed the State Department. And of course, as you all will know, one of the reasons that Iraq was such a disaster was because all the carefully thought through policies of the State Department were dumped into the waste paper basket by Donald Rumsfeld, who didn't want to hear anything about the details of Iraq or the problems of the ancient civilization and so on. The hell with it, he said. We're going to plunge in there and be garlanded with roses. Well, that, I think, has been a fair disaster. And what it means in the case of both North Korea and of Iran is that we're starting, so to speak, at ground zero in trying to build up some common understanding, and even more important than that, some common trust. If you have a friend you haven't seen for 20 years, trust is going to be quite a difficult thing to build up quickly. And one of the reasons it's so hard to get any real understanding of why, for example, Iran has pursued enrichment, it says for nuclear civil energy, the West says for weapons, is because you don't know much about Iran. We don't know who the Secretary of Energy is. We haven't talked to him. We don't know much about what the motivations are. All we know is that you can put whatever interpretation you like. And if you look at the words of Mr. Ahmadinejad in Columbia University, where, in my view, very unwisely, he was introduced in an extremely sarcastic and humiliating way, which is hardly sensible. He does repeat over and over again, I've got the quotes here, that he doesn't want any wars, that he doesn't believe there's any need for shooting, that he thinks there's lots of room for conversation, he believes in negotiation, he believes in talk, talk, talk. And of course, the problem in Iran is who moves first, who blinks first, and essentially the one thing that I think Laranjani, the nuclear negotiator for Iran, is trying to do is to get a simultaneous laying on the table of an agreement by the United States to offer security guarantees, and at the same time an agreement by Iran to cease the development of nuclear weapons in any way for the time being. Leave that on one side, two final ones. The third one I want to mention is, not forgetting we've got climate change and we've got the issue of nuclear proliferation, is the war on terror. I was very pleased when, following the attack on Glasgow Airport the day after he became Prime Minister, our Prime Minister said very clearly that he would not use the term the war on terror. He thought it to be a wholly inappropriate term, a view I've shared very strongly ever since 9/11. If 9/11 had been presented as what it was, a crime against humanity, where all humanity had a common cause to try to punish such crimes, we would not have split the world into being a split between Muslim and Christian, or between the Middle East and other parts of the world. We would have seen it as what it was. If the IRA blew up, as it tried to do, the British Prime Minister, and did blow up 3 other cabinet ministers, what was the fine distinction that said that that was not part of a war on terror? What would have happened if the British had bombed Dublin because the IRA hid in the Republic of Ireland in order to protect itself from being picked up by the police? Americans would rightly have been appalled. Rightly have been appalled. It's exactly what we are trying to do now. It's a big mistake to talk about wars on terror because it turns it back into wars between sovereign states.